Thank you so much, Jane. It is a real pleasure to be in this forum again. Many years ago, when I was at Port Alberni Port Authority, we actually were involved in the association. And as many of you know, I used to write for Jane in BC Shipping News. So about 3 weeks back, she said, "Hey, I've got an idea." And I said, "I'll do what I typically do, is I enlisted the help of some really smart people, and I just get the pleasure of moderating and moving the session along today." So I'd like to introduce Hanh Le-Griffin. Some of you may already know Hanh, but she's the Director of Ports and Marine Terminal for Hatch Engineering, and she's also an Adjunct Associate Professor of Civil Environmental Engineering at the University of Southern California. Now, she directs and delivers a number of port projects and is heavily involved in technology and environmental issues. So, Lei, just so everyone can sort of understand your voice, would you just say hi to everyone, and then we'll know that the microphone is working correctly? Can we hear Lei, just to make sure that...
Sorry. Hello, everyone. I'm Le-Griffin, as Daryl just mentioned, but in the professional world, my name short is Le-Griffin, and people know me as Le. So please call me Le.
Thank you, Lei. So my other distinguished colleague today is Phil Davies, transportation economist, and he's based in Vancouver. And for many years now, 35 plus, he's been involved in extensive market research, trade planning, and other things. Lots of work related to drayage, port operations, and goods movement, and a number of policy-related projects for various governments. So that's who we are. We like to have this a bit of a conversation. In some respects, our title is overly ambitious, but if we can't aim for really a little something that will touch on the interest of everyone else, I will be moderating the time, and I'll also be looking for the questions, but we are going to have a question and answer period at the end, and we'll kind of work our way through that. So now that we've done whoops. Okay. So now we've done the introductions. So we're going to quickly do an overview of some maritime cargo and industry trends. Time doesn't permit us to get into a lot of that, but Phil's going to do a deeper dive on at least some of the trends of the container. We're going to spend most of our time talking about logistics infrastructure and investments. We've kind of grouped it into major ports and gateways and regionally significant ports. But in that subset of our discussion today, we're also going to be talking about some of the policy impacts driving the nature of trade opportunities. Particularly, there's things in the competitive environment and obviously in environmental sustainability. And then we're going to transition into a brief section on value creation opportunities before we get to the question and answers. So we've already met each other. So I think if anyone reads the news, we clearly have seen a lot of turmoil in the container markets, and Phil is going to walk us through a lot of things. And so needless to say, by the nature of this group today, if you really want to ship something today or tomorrow or the next day, you're probably not going to go to Phil, Lei, or myself. That's not the part of the market that we participate in, but rather we took a look at both structural changes and what is occurring in the market, both short and long term. And so Phil's going to dive deeper into the container market to kind of setting the stage. I wanted to talk about break bulk and project cargo, because what we've seen also is where there is a bit of turmoil and turbulence in the container market. There is a knock-on impact on some of those markets, but clearly that sector of the market, when it comes from a port and logistics point of view, we have potential for rising rates, truck equipment, driver shortages. And so in some respects, the container market and from a port perspective, break bulk and project cargo often have some similar interests. The other two that I just want to touch on, I think, are autos and dry bulk. We're going to get into if people want to ask us specific questions, but we recognize that certainly the auto industry has got a number of challenges, both in terms of new automobile imports, largely driven by computers, and then obviously there's a lot of automobile parts in the container sector. We probably could do a session on the dry bulk market alone, but it is fair to say that as we enter out of the COVID-induced impact of slower economic growth, there is going to be lots of commodity movements. And really, I think also on the West Coast of North America, a large issue that we'll all be watching is what is the state of play in terms of geopolitical relations as it impacts agricultural exports. And so looking at the time and interest, if we want to dive deeper in those sectors in the question and answer, we'll be happy to. So Phil, I will let you take it over from here and you can tell me how to advance the slides.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much. Pleasure to be invited to speak. I always love to hear the sound of my own voice. And it's so much better when other people are listening. So I thought it'd be worthwhile at this point to sort of take a longer look at market fundamentals in the container sector in the context of COVID. And, you know, the theme of our presentation is kind of around the post-COVID era, but we're not quite there yet. But you know, with statistics up to the end of 2020, we can have a look at what the impacts have been to date. And you know, I think it's worthwhile to compare it just to other significant events, most particularly the impact of the 2008 recession on trade volumes. And you can see that to date, the impact of COVID has really been relatively minor. You know, there was a big peak in 2018. I don't know if everyone remembers the boom of 2018. With a bit of a decline in 2019 before we hit COVID, and another slight decline. But you know, compared to the depth of decline that we saw in the 2008 recession, this so far has not been that major an event in terms of total volumes. Next slide. Now, there have been long-term trends in the market shares of ports from the various regions in U.S. imports, which have been going on for quite a long time. You can see those trends are in general a decline in the West Coast ports share, and an increase in the East Coast ports. And the other major trend we've seen has been the increasing share of Western Canadian traffic into the U.S. import market. Next slide. And the bulk of that traffic, at least the Western Canadian traffic that's been penetrating the market, has been the what's called the inland point intermodal traffic, which is containers shipped direct from the ports inland, with Chicago being by far the largest market. And there did appear to be a long-term impact of the 2008 recession on the balance between those IPI or international containers that were shipped inland and the domestic traffic, which is traffic which includes international cargo transloaded to domestic. And you can see that the international cargo, in fact, only recovered to the 2007 level by 2018, and has declined again with the impact of COVID in 2020. So there was some sort of structural change there, which significantly altered the balance, which has some significant impacts for the kind of infrastructure and investments that are required for ports. Next slide. And the rising market share of Western Canadian ports of Prince Rupert and Vancouver shows up very clearly, and these are international intermodal market shares for containers, and the trends here are very easy to see. I mean, very substantial increase in the Western Canadian share. Ongoing decline in the Southwest, which is LA Long Beach primarily, and really a very significant decline in the market share for the South, the Northwest, which is basically the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. So there have been some major changes in the sort of distribution of the market amongst those ports. Next slide. Now, that was up to the end of 2020. What we've seen in 2021 is an entirely different sort. We've seen a massive demand surge. We've seen port congestion and capacity constraints. It appears that many North American ports now have dwell times for containers over 30 days. And we have record high container ocean shipping rates. I saw the latest spot rate estimates are, $10,000 a container from Shanghai to LA. And 2 years ago, that would have been $2,000. So basically, the whole system is so congested that it's almost impossible to get a container from Asia to North America. And for shippers that are desperate to do that, they'll pay almost any price. Next slide. So under normal circumstances, the sort of level of market that's available to container ports is kind of a function of the population that's within trucking distance. And under normal circumstances, to be competitive with intermodal rail, you're talking around 800 miles or thereabouts. So this figure here kind of shows what that is for some of the major container ports. Having said that, under current conditions, these appear to no longer apply. I have read accounts of refrigerated containers from being shipped from Asia to the port of Philadelphia and trucked across the country to California. So that's quite an extension of a trucking catchment area. Now, having said that, it seems unlikely to me that that's going to continue indefinitely. Also, the commercial behavior of Class 1 railways. I mean, we've seen developments at the West Coast ports, particularly Union Pacific, putting $5,000 per box surcharges on domestic containers, and actually putting a 2-week moratorium on accepting new international traffic. So I mean, that certainly has significant impacts on the ports that they're serving. Next slide. So the consequence of all this is that the shippers are desperately and shipping lines are desperately searching for any means they can find to move containers off the docks. A great short sea shipping example here in the Lower Mainland is that in June there have been a couple of barge loads of containers shipped from Port of Seattle's T30 terminal to Fraser Surrey docks by barge, really to be put onto the Canadian rail network because the BNSF network was too congested to move them off the dock. I think another probably longer term success has been the use of short sea shipping out of the port of Nanaimo to connect directly to the DP World Container Terminal in Vancouver. But what we're hearing now, of course, is the impact of COVID is people talking a great deal about the requirement for supply chain resiliency, which to be cynical is something that everyone wants. Nobody wants to pay for it until something goes wrong. But all of the ports are scrambling for means to cope with the current congestion, looking at off-terminal support. In the longer run, the use of alternative fuels will play a role. Next slide. So what's happened in the container sector is that the success of the ports has been built on economies of scale. So you're talking for gateway ports, you're talking 12,000 to 20,000 TEU vessels, and you're talking 12,000 foot intermodal trains to make it competitive for the long hauls. And that's a difficult market for smaller regional ports to compete in. There are some regional ports, such as the Port of Grays Harbor, which have promoted the concept of the trade corridor. We get the next slide, Daryl. And some of these congestion issues at the major ports have been opportunities for the smaller ports. Daryl, I think you came up with this example. Maybe you want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, and I think this was really an interesting example of both congestion and supply chain, but there's a company out of Washington State that really is the importer of e-bikes. And it was so congested both in the Asian terminals where they were sourcing that they actually engaged in a shipment upon the vessel that we see in this picture in July, and it actually went into the port of Everett. And I think one of the things that we wanted to kind of talk about here is that for some ports, there's both congestion in North America, there's congestion in Asian ports. The challenge is whether these, and we're calling it opportunistic cargo, they are an opportunity for some regional ports, but where's the baseline traffic to augment the infrastructure investment? And the challenge is, I think everybody here, at least on the West Coast in North America, and some of our participants on this call will note that the lead time for port infrastructure is very, very long. And so one of the challenges that from a straight infrastructure point of view, it takes a long time to get infrastructure. And if you only have opportunistic cargo, is there a business case? But Lei, you're the engineer. You sort of straddle the world between big and little, and maybe there's an opportunity for you to offer some comments here about just how ports are kind of wrestling with congestion, and particularly what does that mean for a regionally significant port?
Yes, so I think that then obviously different ports respond to the issue differently. But I just wanted to add another example, which the example you just cited out, in terms of how ports take advantage of the congestion conditions and capture a new business, and even got a grant for it. So that is a case of a port of Huaynimi, which the port recent successful project is that they just secure another trade with Peru to import blueberry. And we're talking about California import blueberries. Everyone say why? We have a lot of blueberries in our Central Valley, but the thing is that we only have a seasons of it. And the good thing is that during the blueberry seasons that California can produce, we usually import via East Coast and truck to the market in the West Coast. And that create a lot of trucking fleet, and mileage. So one of the helps for Port of Huaynimi is to get a new technology in terms of how we can fumigate a certain import agricultural cargo, so that we can pass forward with the cold chains and distribute to the market and avoid a lot of truck traffic and truck trip needed. So I think when you have one challenge, the other port capture it as an opportunities, and that is always the things that we should look into when we have a challenge and opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Lei. And so one of the things that we're essentially showing on this slide is that there is, let's say the Port of Everett is probably closer to a spot market opportunity, but it is interesting that they engaged also, at least this case with the shipper, engaged directly with the shipping line for this service. So what we see is a combination of shippers wanting to try new things, and then where you have, for instance, a baseline cargo like Lei said, which is blueberries, they're able to really take a thought about, okay, where's the supply chain? How can we get into a core market? Obviously, California is a large market, and then we'll reroute and make some significant changes. But it does require, like I say, ports and others to really begin to sort of think about, congestion doesn't automatically lead to a growth opportunity. You have to be able to either have infrastructure that's available for use, or in the case that Lei gave an example of, is you have to be willing to invest in some perhaps new technology, or be able to handle the cold chain requirements of a specific shipper. But we'll just go on to the next slide and give a couple more examples of some innovation in the marketplace. Phil, I'll let you pick this up here as well.
Yeah, The Port of Nanaimo's new auto terminal is another great example of an opportunity. I think this is a new facility which has been developed at the Port of Nanaimo. It is handling European vehicles which previously were shipped to the Port of Halifax and shipped across the country by rail. And they found a better way of doing that by sending the vessels all the way to Vancouver Island and then trucking them across probably the ferry, I think, to the mainland. So it's another example of where, you know, there were potentially congestion issues at the Port of Halifax, and certainly there have been over the years weather issues related to the transportation of vehicles. And now, you know, this is a new solution that was an opportunity for the Port of Nanaimo.
The other thing that I would add, that I think that the Port of Nanaimo facility is probably a little unique in the Canadian market, but if you actually take a look at the west coast of North America, a lot of the regionally significant ports are actually engaged in the automobile trade. In this case, Vancouver is land constrained. They don't really have a lot of room for more auto imports. So what we are seeing is that there is this opportunity, and in the case of Canada with a lower kind of population density than the US West Coast, this is really a regional service center that is expanding back into kind of Western Canada. Now, the other example that we have on this slide is the Port of Stockton's zero emissions freight facility. It's not an example of a current infrastructure today, but we wanted to highlight of it because in sort of prepping for this work, our team was struck by the fact that the leadership of the Port of Stockton prior to this had been taking kind of an ad hoc approach to grants and really hadn't defined where the port wanted to be or had really put a lot of effort. So they recently laid out a zero emission freight facility electrification blueprint, but their new leadership, it really is an example of where the port is responding to both competitive and environmental pressures and basically saying, hey, the days of us being reactive can only take us so far. And so we wanted to put a shout out to this. And maybe it's because I've spent a fair portion of my professional career, let's say, working with regionally significant ports. I've been involved as CEO of the Port Alberni Port Authority, the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority. But really, I think our team also would want to stress that port operation and business development for regionally significant ports really go hand in hand together. In some ways, we were reflecting that it's very similar to the development of the short line railway business, that you can, bigger ports have trade representatives and all sorts of other kind of apparatus in place to advance the work of the organization. But for really regionally significant ports that don't have those big structure is simplifying your governance structure, who can make clear operational and commercial decisions and still practice good governance and environmental sustainability. The key going forward is that we are seeing rapid changes in the marketplace. And maybe the COVID has taught us that those extreme pressures are maybe at some point down the road that will be lessened, but the marketplace continues to evolve. Phil alluded to this, some of the container markets were structural changes over time, but still they play out in volume surges or other challenges in a time and space that really do require timely decision making. So we just wanted to kind of prompt people's thinking on that regard before we go to the next slide here. So really, we've talked about sort of the competitive landscape and environmental sustainability. And Lei, in the work that you're doing for your clients, obviously we're going to protect client confidentiality, but how are some of the bigger ports and the smaller ports navigating this world between enhanced competition? There's obviously pressures for cargo to flow today, but still be environmental responsible. And I think in some of our earlier discussions, you had some thoughts about, as an engineer, where you're helping some of your clients navigate this space, and would love to hear some reflections.
Yes, I think that for all of the ports that been dealing with the same issues, how we maintain our competitiveness of the port as well as prepare for future growth. So all of the ports that we've been have a pleasure working with is always there are two clear decision on near terms and long terms. And a lot of, the COVID, after COVID situation have confused a lot of people. But a lot of question about, is it the current what we see in terms of surge and shortage in capacity and then high rate? Is it just because of COVID's impact for short terms, or it could be a long terms? So when we come down to how we prepare and cope with the current situation, I think the first thing that I always see our ports, clients clearly, figure it out or clearly look at near-term solutions and also prepare for long-term developments. So some of the near-term solution, I think that is always issues of how to improve or how to maintain and strengthen the efficiency of operations, right? And then for the longer terms, that's the word of modernization of the port. So especially, I want to speak, I think it will be applied for all the port, but especially for California port, that one of the regions that always pioneer in terms of how we mitigate the negative impact of port and goods movements activities. And everyone already knows of the 2030 near zero emission mandate. So what we see is that a lot of the port right now utilize the technology, right, available information technologies as a way to better utilize the asset in place, improving by, address the environmental issues by either switch more cargo to rail and more efficient truck movements, as Phil already mentioned, by supporting inland facility, and also look further in the future that most of the port already look into how we can modernize and providing sufficient and cost-effective capacity to handle the future growth. And one of the issues that I think one of the slides we have before is that how we deal with the energy issues, right? It either we realize on to meet the zero emission, whether we have to realize on the electrifications of on the equipments and also the power need in the terminal, or we also can at the same time utilize the new technology in terms of renewable fuel and some advanced technology in fueling and engine design. I see that a lot of port in Southern California have a strong in leading in this case, but even our regional port, like the Port of San Diego, Hueneme, and one of the clients that we are working right now in Alaska, already looking into how we can cope with the zero emission and operating port greener and more efficient. So in short, I think that it's clearly near-term solutions is how to improve the efficiency and take advantage of technologies that we have in place, and also prepare technology advancement for a future plan. And on the plan that we have came across with is also very flexible, because the question is what Phil just mentioned, the market demand, and how stable and how the trends that we on the port keep close eye on when they prepare the near-term and long-term action plan.
So thank you, Lei. So really what we've done at a very high level is really kind of touch down on a couple market drivers of some of the changes, and really the tools in this graph or the chart is really how do you create value? How do you create value for the customer in the short term and the long term? Lei alluded to. I'm looking at the time now, Jane, and I think it's the point where we should also begin to consider transitioning into the question and answer. So as you can see, there is not, post-COVID world, and I don't think it's a surprise to any of the professionals on this group, a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think that it has, COVID has taught us that there is going to be short-term commercial pressures, and those commercial pressures and operational pressures can consume a lot of management time. And so how do you also create the space for thinking that midterm port modernization that Lei alluded to? So Jane, looking at the time, and maybe we have some questions, maybe you want to lead off. We're your guest, so I'm going to take my clue from you.
Daryl, that was fantastic. Thank you. Do you still need to share your screen, or should we go to a view for everybody?
We can go to a view for everyone.
Okay. And hang on one second. We'll do the gallery view. Thank you so much, Lei, Phil, and Daryl. That was really good. I'll throw it out there if anybody would like to ask a quick question. We've got about 5 minutes. If not, I do have a question. Daryl, Phil, Lei, what's the best advice you can offer a regionally significant port that is dealing with changes in their cargo volume and mix? So big picture sort of question there.
I think maybe I'll start, and then I'm going to let my two learned colleagues go. But I think the reality is that when we're in kind of this type of association, so we're covering the Pacific Rim, right? And so we know that in spite of some of these major changes, there is going to be some regionally significant ports that their economy is a bit different. So if I could allude to Alaska for a moment, Jane, that we know that some of the ports there were obviously built with cargo capacity to support the oil and gas sector in the North Slope, and that traffic is probably not ever going to coming back. But I think the question for them is in this period of time where they may not be fielding as much commercial pressure. One of the competitive advantages is to address the question that Lei raised, is thinking about the modernization, taking the time to understand the structural differences between the noise and the clutter. One of the things that the major ports, such as LA, Long Beach, Vancouver, their challenges, there's so much operational pressure day to day that I don't know how much time the executives need and are able to think mid to long term. So it may seem like a blessing in disguise, but using that space, and I think COVID has taught us as well, that using our time to think, because we know that the next generation of port investments is going to be different. But Lei or Phil, I'd love you to offer your reflections on my answer.
So Phil, if you don't mind, I just want to touch base on our friend in Alaska. So remember, I understand Houston and Alaska port hit the most when the oil and gas industry is changing the directions. But don't forget, Alaska port is leading, I would say 20-something years, leading in the nation's seafood, industry, commercial seafood industry. So there are a number of terminals now looking into how to improve the cold chains with a high demand from the Asian market. And then up in Aleutian chains or the Southwest Alaska, even those ports as Valdez. I was have a chance to work on Valdez projects in my past in 2016, and also with support of Anchorage when the port does the modernizations. We have a number of different the port are looking into how they tap into the infrastructure, improve the cold chains business, and support also the most, I would say the economics dependence of the communities up in remote Alaska, as well as a job market. So how you tap into the niche market, how you play, quickly change your tap into the opportunity, I think that is key. And these days, technologies that allow both shipping line using new technologies to support the cold chain on the transit as well as the terminal side as well. So that's the case that I want to chime in what Daryl tried to mention. So back to Phil.
Yeah, briefly, I just want to talk about some of, for many of the regional ports, their long-term structural challenges. And in British Columbia, the biggest example is that most of them were mostly dedicated to break bulk shipments of forest products. And, you know, for a number of reasons, that traffic has more or less disappeared. One, because much of it has gone to container ships because of the availability of cheap container capacity, and the other one, just decline in the timber supply of the province. So, you know, in order to adjust to that, I mean, they have to look for new markets, and you know, and it can be either a large or a small scale opportunity. You know, I think if you want to look at the large scale success, obviously it's the Port of Prince Rupert, where they converted their break bulk terminal to the Fairview container terminal and have done extraordinarily well. I see Don's on the line, so congratulations on that. And you know, there are certainly railways that are looking to try and capitalize on that same model at various locations. The you know, CN is looking at being a partner in building a new container terminal in Quebec City, and that's also Don Trussell's baby. And also they're looking at the possibility of expanding port operations at Mobile, Alabama, to, you know, to take full advantage of their network. CP is trying to do the same thing with Port St. John in New Brunswick. So, you know, for some ports, those are larger scale opportunities, but for other ports, like, and again, the Nanaimo is a very good example where there was a market opportunity simply because they could offer a better logistics solution for a niche market. And you know, whichever of those opportunities is available is what they should look for.
Excellent. I see we're almost out of time, but I do see Jeannie's asked a question about, are we seeing any fuel shortages in the maritime sector? We are starting to see fuel challenges on the air sector for crop dusters to international carriers. Is that...
Maybe I'll touch on that one because I've been involved in a number of projects about green shipping or doing alternative fuels. And there was certainly a lot of fear prior to COVID that the new higher environmental standards for marine fuel would lead to shortages and price increases. Phil's the economist, but raising rates have a way of making that issue almost non-existent at the moment. There may be local issues somewhere, but I'm not seeing any of the chatter that that's a significant impediment to growth and development. Rather, I'd say crew changes and how the industry responds to the needs of mariners is just as important on the water side, probably more so these days than the fuel issue. But Phil or Lei, any other reflections?
One of the things that I observe is that for a new type of fuel, obviously there are a lot of terminals that not have the infrastructure for fueling for the new type. For example, LNGs. That's just one example, but we've been talking about many other type of renewable energy chain for the vessel bunker. So I see a number of ports that have no space for develop the facility, for example, and at the same time, other port or regional port have a space for it. And one example, we're talking about a different type of fuel, but offshore wind energy. One of the projects that we've been able to support a little bit on in Eureka along the Northern California coast. So obviously Humber Bay was one of the locations, but I see that also because other ports don't have the space or the facility, and the industry moving toward to needed the facility for fueling, then other regional port could see it as a niche or the opportunity that worth look into.
Yeah, briefly, I haven't heard any reports of that. Logically, you might think it might happen since the shipping lines are throwing every vessel they've got into the trade when they're getting $10,000 a container from Shanghai to LA. But you know, one thing which may be reducing the impact is the fact that most of those ships don't seem to be sailing; they seem to be sitting at anchor, waiting to get into the port. So maybe that doesn't take quite so much fuel.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good question, Jeannie. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there, but